This video is on life on Earth. We start with the Precambrian Era. The Precambrian Era, the name means before the Cambrian period. This old but still common term was originally used to refer to the whole period of Earth's history before the formation of the oldest rocks with recognizable fossils in them. In the last few decades, however, geologists have found that there are some hard to discern fossils in some Precambrian rocks, so this period is now also known as the Cryptozoic or obscure life eon. The Precambrian covers almost 90% of the entire history of the Earth. It has been divided into three eras: the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. The Precambrian era comprises all of geologic time prior to 600 million years ago. The Precambrian was originally defined as the era that predated the emergence of life in the Cambrian period. It is now known, however, that life on Earth began by the early Archean and that fossilized organisms became more and more abundant throughout Precambrian time. Two major subdivisions of the last part of the Precambrian are the Archean, which is the oldest, and the Proterozoic. Rocks younger than 600 million years ago are considered part of the Phanerozoic. The Paleozoic is the earliest of three geologic eras of the Phanerozoic eon. It is the longest of the Phanerozoic eras, lasting from 541 to 251 million years ago, and is subdivided into six geologic periods: the Paleozoic, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. The Paleozoic comes after the Neoproterozoic era of the Proterozoic eon and is followed by the Mesozoic era. The Paleozoic was a time of dramatic geological, climatic, and evolutionary change. The Cambrian witnessed the most rapid and widespread diversification of life in Earth's history, known as the Cambrian explosion, in which most modern phyla first appeared. Fish, arthropods, amphibians, and diapsids all evolved during the Paleozoic. Life began in the ocean but eventually transitioned onto land, and by the late Paleozoic, it was dominated by various forms of organisms. Great forests of primitive plants covered the continents, many of which formed the coal beds of Europe and eastern North America. Toward the end of the era, the first modern plants appeared. The Paleozoic era ended with the largest extinction event in the history of the Earth. The effects of this catastrophe were so devastating that it took life on land 30 million years into the Mesozoic era to recover. Recovery of life in the sea may have been much faster. The Mesozoic era is an interval of geologic time from about 250 to 66 million years ago. It is also called the Age of Reptiles, a phrase introduced by the 19th century paleontologist Gideon Mantell. This era is also called, from a paleobotanist view, the Age of Conifers. Mesozoic means middle life. It is one of three geologic eras of the Phanerozoic eon, preceded by the Paleozoic and succeeded by the Cenozoic. The era is subdivided into three major periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and Cretaceous, which are further subdivided into a number of stages. And finally, we have the Cenozoic. The Cenozoic era is the current geological era, covering the period from 66 million years ago to the present day. The Cenozoic is also known as the Age of Mammals because of the large mammals that dominate it. The continents also moved into their current positions during this era. Alright, and then we need to be familiar with all these forms of classification, so we're going to go through all of them. All living organisms are classified into groups based on very basic shared characteristics. Organisms within each group are then further divided into smaller groups. These smaller groups are based on more detailed similarities within each larger group. This grouping system makes it easier for scientists to study certain groups of organisms. Characteristics such as appearance, reproduction, mobility, and functionality are just a few ways in which living organisms are grouped together. These specialized groups are collectively called the classification of living things. The classification of living things has 7 levels. Those are kingdom, phylum, classes, order, families, genus, and species. Okay, so we'll go through them. With kingdoms, the most basic classification of living things is kingdoms. Currently, there are 5 kingdoms. Living things are placed into certain kingdoms based on how they obtain their food, the types of cells that make up their body, and the number of cells they contain. The phylum is the next level following kingdom in the classification of living things. It is an attempt to find some kind of physical similarities among organisms within a kingdom. These physical similarities suggest that there is a common ancestry among those organisms in a particular phylum. Classes are a way to further divide organisms of a phylum. As you could probably guess, organisms of a class have even more in common than those in an entire phylum. Humans belong to the mammal class because we drink milk as a baby. Organisms in each class are further broken down into orders. A taxonomy key is used to determine which order an organism belongs. A taxonomy key is nothing more than a checklist of characteristics that determines how organisms are grouped together. Orders are divided into families. Organisms within a family have more in common than with organisms in any classification level above it. Because they share so much in common, organisms of a family are said to be related to each other. Humans are in the hominid family. Genus is a way to describe the generic name for an organism. This classification is very specific, so there are fewer organisms within each one. For this reason, there are a lot of different genera among both animals and plants. When using taxonomy to name an organism, the genus is used to determine the first part of its 2-part name. And then finally we have species. Species is as specific as you can get. It is the lowest and most strict level of classification of living things. The main criterion for an organism to be placed in a particular species is the ability to breed with other organisms of that same species. The species of an organism determines the second part of its 2-part name.